In the industrial era, business owners are always looking for cheap sources of labor. One of those sources, of course, is going to be the freed slaves after the Civil War. However, racism of not wanting to hire blacks, or simply the belief that blacks wouldn't provide enough workers for the workforce, immigrants were also a good source of cheap labor. This presentation is about the immigration patterns of the late 1800s and into the 1900s. The term new versus old immigrants is very important. Old immigrants would have come from Western and Northern Europe and would have had a much easier time learning English and adjusting to American culture. However, more and more immigrants were beginning to come from Eastern and Southern Europe, and those people became known as new immigrants. This map from an old Regents exam shows the drastic increase in the late 1800s, early 1900s of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. The language barrier and culture barrier is a little bit harder for these immigrants than old immigrants. A few of the new sources of immigration. Italy. Poverty and rising food prices brought millions of Italians to America in the late 1800s. Hence, some of the ethnic neighborhoods from the last presentation, like Little Italy in Chicago. China. Chinese immigrants were willing to work for extremely low wages. The contractors that helped build the Transcontinental Railroad took full advantage of this. This made them very unpopular among those who felt that they were stealing their jobs. There are many accounts in these time periods of Chinese immigrants being assaulted in major cities because of this view. Russian Jews left Europe mainly because they were escaping religious persecution. There are many reasons why someone might leave, and reasons that they are attracted to the place that they are going. This is called push and pull factors. Negative things about one's homeland and positive things about America lead to an increase in emigration from Europe and China and immigration to America. Some examples: population pressure in Europe and a lack of pressure in the United States. So housing is likely going to be less expensive. The availability of jobs is going to be better. The lack of land in Europe and the abundance of land in the United States. There's little social mobility in Europe, and there's much better chances at social mobility in the United States. These are just a few of the reasons people would leave Europe and China and come to America. An immigrant's life in the United States has good and bad. Exploitation means that immigrants were very desperate for work and were often exploited at low wages, meaning they were taken advantage of. Ghettos. Tenement neighborhoods, or slums/ghettos, had absolutely horrendous conditions. In 1890, famous muckraker Jacob Riis writes a book, How the Other Half Lives. He includes in this work photographs, and those photographs, more than anything else, open the eyes of the upper and middle classes to life as a working class citizen. Americanization. At Ellis Island and other immigration centers, names were changed. Once you lived in the U.S., you were encouraged to learn English and abandon your native culture and native religion and native language. So Americanization in some ways is a good thing because you're assimilating, but in other ways is a bad thing because you're taught to more or less abandon everything from the nation that you came from. Some examples of Americanization. My wife, Mrs. Baker, her family name was Jugan before we got married. Prior to coming to the United States, Jugan, which is spelled with a J, was actually spelled Zugan, D-Z-U-G-A-N. D-Z in Polish sounds like J. So this was probably an inadvertent change to the name. Mr. Zahner's wife's family name was Sullivan. Prior to immigration to the United States, her ancestor's name was probably O'Sullivan. The O really means of Sullivan, meaning in Ireland there was probably a town called Sullivan, and in probably the medieval period, people that were from Sullivan got the surname O'Sullivan, meaning this is so-and-so from Sullivan, and then the name stuck. And O'Sullivan was shortened at Ellis Island, probably because of discrimination against the Irish, to simply Sullivan. A friend of mine in college, his name was Mike DiPola. Mike's family name was changed to Pauls. Again, a complete change, the most blatant example of these three of a change, and this was because of discrimination against Italian immigrants. It was many years later that Mike's family changed their name back to DiPola. You can see in this photograph a back alley of an ethnic ghetto and how the conditions of many immigrant groups were really horrendous. Here are some photographs I took on a trip to New York City with Mrs. Baker many years ago before we were even married. Here's the photo of the sign for Ellis Island Immigration Museum and the Statue of Liberty National Monument. I'm going to focus on Ellis Island. This is the view of Ellis Island from the ferry that took us to the museum. And this is the first view that many immigrants are going to have of Ellis Island. Once you enter the building, a tour guide takes you through, and they take you through essentially what the immigrants' experience at Ellis Island would be. If you look at the upper left, it's a photograph of luggage. This photograph is the very first step when you immigrated. You were forced to leave your luggage in a certain area to be inspected. Unfortunately, as you were processed, some Ellis Island workers often stole things from the immigrants' luggage as they were being processed. This is especially sad because if you think about it, many immigrants are coming here because they are impoverished and they're looking for a better life. So what very little is in their luggage is probably what is most valuable to them. In some ways that would be valuable to someone else. In other ways it might even be just sentimental. Either way, when something is stolen from you, it's going to hurt. On your way up to the main processing room after stacking up your luggage, you went up a set of stairs, which you can see on the upper right. And if you notice, you have to go up and turn, take a few steps on that landing, turn again, and then at the top of the stairs, there's another landing and railing before you enter the room, in which you have to turn again. The reason you had to go up this set of stairs and turn so many times, instead of one straight set of stairs upward, was so that a doctor at the top of the stairs could view every side of an immigrant. And the last view they had of you at the top of the stairs, they would look at your eyes, your ears, your nose, your mouth, quality of your teeth, your throat, to see if you were completely healthy. They wanted you to be completely healthy because you were likely going to be working in a factory. And if you couldn't be productive in a factory, you were not wanted. Once you entered into the great main room, which you see on the lower left, it's massive. It's probably about the size of a football field. And if you look on the lower right, this is a modern view of just a couple of benches. In the time period in which Ellis Island was still processing immigrants, there were many, many rows of these benches. And at the far side of the room, you would sit down and simply shift down one seat at a time until you made your way across the football field size room. When you got to the other end, after you answered a series of questions at a podium, the Ellis Island workers would direct you to this staircase. You'll notice this staircase is divided into three parts. The first part says you're free to go. You're now a citizen of the United States. The second says, well, you have lice or some other minor condition. You need to go to the infirmary for treatment, and after treatment, you're a citizen of the United States. The third, however, was the line for deportation. You were going to be sent right back to where you came from. Now, if you can imagine an immigrant family going through the process, they reach this stage, and if they don't speak English, multiple members of the family could be going in multiple directions. The tragedy of deportation, even if you could avoid that, you may still get separated of who's going directly into the city and who has to stay in the infirmary. You have to remember, this is not an era of cell phones. This isn't even an era of telephones in general. So the ability to communicate is very limited. And something as simple as being held back in the infirmary could separate you from your family forever. Outside of the museum are memorial walls, and on these memorial walls we found Mrs. Baker's family name. Her great-grandparents, Elizabeth Fedorzik Zugan and Joseph Zugan. Here's a photograph of Mrs. Baker's family reunion. And in the center of this photograph, you can see great-great-uncle Tony Biskupik. Uncle Tony is Czech. He came from Czechoslovakia shortly after World War II, escaping the Soviets and communism in Eastern Europe. So the year he came is 1948. He's leaving to escape the Soviets. There's actually a couple of family stories. I never really had the guts to ask Uncle Tony because it might bring back bad memories. But Uncle Tony and a friend, as they were escaping Czechoslovakia, had to hide amongst dead bodies so that the Soviets would not discover them and execute them for trying to escape. He also had to hide underwater in a river, breathing through a reed, which is a hollow branch, kind of like a bamboo shoot almost. And both of those stories I can't confirm, but even if they're not true for Uncle Tony, it was true for many others. When he got to the United States, he literally had nothing but the clothes on his back and some loose change in his pocket. I had the chance to speak with him and have kept close touch with him via Skype ever since. Uncle Tony lives in Connecticut and is happily retired. This is really a great example of what someone coming to the United States from a horrible situation abroad could make a really decent life for themselves here. The melting pot theory. This is the belief that various cultures can simply be melded together. It's an annoying Schoolhouse Rock video. However, that Schoolhouse Rock video actually does a pretty good job of portraying the idea of a melting pot. In some ways, this is an attempt to respect elements of all cultures, but in other ways, it's kind of nationalistic in that it promotes American culture as superior to all others, and that you should assimilate and abandon much of your native culture. There's also the view of cultural pluralism. This means that a person can live amongst one culture, but also take pride in their heritage and background. A great example is being bilingual. So if your family is from a Hispanic nation in the Caribbean or South America or Mexico, then you probably speak Spanish. You probably have many customs from the native nation in which your family came from. Under the view of cultural pluralism, it's seen that both of those things are important, both being a part of American society, but also maintaining your native culture. This is very different than the melting pot theory, which says there will be one culture, one American culture. The cartoon on the right is simply a joke. I selected Spanish. Now see if you can figure out how to withdraw your allowance, motivating your kid to learn a second language. I just thought it was funny. You can laugh at me all you want for being nerdy. Lastly, there's a term, Nativism. It can be most directly compared to racism, but do not confuse nativism with racism, because nativism is anti-immigration. It's discriminating against immigrants already in the United States and attempting to stop others from coming to the United States. Some examples of trying to stop others from coming into the United States are the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. After the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, there is a view that we no longer need any of these people. Further, literacy testing was instituted in 1917, hoping to only get educated immigrants. And then lastly, the Quota Acts of 1921 and 1924 limited immigration from very specific countries. Now, the reason I say this is so different from racism is because racism targets someone based on skin color. In many cases, being anti-immigrant included people that were traditionally what would be described as white, such as Irish or Scottish immigrants. Visually, they look white, like other traditional white Americans. However, they speak a different language and they are competing for jobs, and therefore a nativist hates them just as much as a minority who is an immigrant. Now, don't think that nativism doesn't still exist today. Movements to build a border fence, limit even legal immigration, and deport illegal immigrants already in the United States are larger than you might think. Watch the news once in a while and you'll notice. There's a bit of irony in this concept of nativism, and not in a funny way, that natural-born American citizens, those that had been born on American soil since the passing of the Constitution, often referred to themselves as those who belonged versus those who didn't. The treatment of who would be referred to as an other included Native Americans, indigenous people that had lived on the North American continent long before it was conquested by Europeans and eventually became the United States. So, again, not in a funny way, but there's a bit of irony. People often don't think before they speak. And so the irony of nativism is not lost in history. This is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you log in and take the online quiz. If you've taken good notes and you use them on the quiz, there's really no reason you shouldn't be getting a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.